Hi, everyone. This is going to be episode 18 in the famous quotes about Paul. And the quoting party is Josephus, a person who lived from 37 AD to 100 AD. Before I introduce him, I want to just tell you that this is also going to be part 4 of our episode 17, famous quotes about Paul, from Robert Eisenman, from whom these quotes were discovered in the first place, and how he explained them is important to the total picture. And that means this episode also helps support the issue or resolution of the issue whether Eisenman's DSS discoveries about the spouter of lies in the Habakkuk Pesher has found one of the most key religious discoveries of all time. All right, so let's look at the biography of Josephus. Flavius Josephus. He was born in AD 37, died in 100 AD. He was a Roman Jewish historian and military leader, best known for writing the Jewish War. He was born in Jerusalem, then part of the Roman province of Judea, to a father of priestly descent and a mother who claimed royal ancestry. He initially fought against the Roman Empire during the First Roman War, as general of the Jewish forces in Galilee. So he would have come from the region of what? Jesus. Until surrendering in 67 AD to the Roman army led by military commander Vespasian Vespasian after the 6-week siege of Yodfat. Josephus claimed the Jewish messianic prophecies that initiated the First Jewish-Roman War made reference to Vespasian becoming Roman emperor. In response, Vespasian decided to keep Josephus as a slave and presumably interpreter. After Vespasian became emperor in AD 69, he granted Josephus his freedom, at which time Josephus assumed the emperor's family name of Flavius. Flavius Josephus fully defected to the Roman side and was granted Roman citizenship. He became an advisor and friend of Vespasian's son Titus, serving as his translator when Titus led the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Josephus, by the way, in his book, will give a very nice description of Jesus, assuming that's a valid paragraph. Some people say it isn't. But to me, if he's somebody who's actually a military commander from Galilee, it wouldn't be beyond doubt. It should be reasonably accepted that he could even have a paragraph about Jesus, given all the events that happened. He actually has a lot more about James the Just than he has about Jesus. And then he has some paragraphs about John the Baptist. So he is literally giving us the only, or one of the only sources of objective history from someone who's Jewish, who, though, is serving the Romans at the time he's saying this. So it has a level of objectivity, or you could even say concession, when he says something that he's saying that this could be conceded as true. And so therefore he's an important historian for Christians to know about and what he says. Now, in this episode, we're going to get to 2 passages to look at today: the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, and the War of the Jews, Book 2. And these are sites that I found through Eisenman, so I'm not claiming I did this work and found it on my own. He has to, for what he does, he has to read everything that Josephus wrote to know all of what it records, because he has to interpolate that to construe and understand ancient documents. All right, so now preliminarily, we have to get some background of what we're reading and who the names are and the players. So there's a statement about the relatives of someone named Solus, and then the activities of Solus is described in 2 places in the works of Josephus. Now, the question is he also known as Paulus? And that's what comes only by studying all of the material that Eisenman gives. And we'll go through that at the end of when we look at what the statements are attributed by Josephus to the activities of Solus. Now, in order to piece it all together, you have to know a couple of things. Three individuals you need to know who they are. One is Herod Antipas. He's the son of Herod the Great. I'll tell you who Herod the Great is in a minute. Herod Agrippa is the grandson of Herod the Great. And then Herod Agrippa II is a great-grandson of Herod the Great. And he's the one who hears Paul's testimony in Acts. And that's the one you might be thinking we're talking about. But actually, that Agrippa is not discussed in the same topics when Solus is talked about in this passage. Solus is talked about in relation to Herod Antipas. And also and that's important because in the Gospels, Herod Antipas is the one who returns Jesus back to Pilate. So really what you need to know is Herod Antipas is not Herod Agrippa. Herod Antipas is not Herod Agrippa II. So I wanted to lay that out here quickly. But what's important is each of these is said, Herod Antipas and Agrippa are said to be relatives. Herod the First are said to be relatives of Solus. So if Solus is Paul, this corroborates what we also see in the New Testament, where Luke says Paul is Manaen was a childhood companion of Herod the Tetrarch, which is another name for Herod Antipas, and Solus, Saul. So there you have it right in the New Testament. Of course, Paul also in Romans 16, verse 13 says, "Salute to the people of in Rome." He tells the Romans, "Please salute my kinsman named Herodion," which means little Herod. Okay, so let's continue. Now, I just want to give you a little bit background as well to another Herod you're probably familiar with, so you can distinguish that person from these other Herods. So this is the great grandfather of one, father of the other. So this is, you probably will remember, Herod ordered the death and murder of all the innocent children in Bethlehem because he knew of the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah would be signaled in such a way that the Magi would responded to it. A star prophecy, star in the sky, would indicate that the coming of the Messiah had happened. By the way, that was the prophecy of Balaam, who later, even though he was a prophet of Christ, ended up apostatizing by teaching people that could eat meat sacrificed to idols, and he was executed. And Jesus in Revelation 2 says that's perfectly right. That is to say, in Revelation 2, Jesus is commending those who refuse to eat meat sacrificed to idols and condemns those Christians who are eating meat sacrificed to idols. And he cites it's the error of Balaam. So he's obviously confirming that result and the execution of Balaam by Moses for that sin. And Jesus telling them how serious an evil sin that is. Anyway, so let's go on. Now, who is Herod Antipas? He is older than Herod Agrippa 1 and 2, just so you know. That's important to place him in history. So he was born in 21 before the Christian era. He died after 39 CE, Christian era, AD, I would say. And what date is unknown. So he may have lived much longer than 39 AD, but we don't know. He's the son of Herod Herod the Great, and he became a tetrarch. That means the kingdom is divided up in 4 parts. In Greek, tetrarch means a ruler of 1/4 of that part. He was a ruler of a minor principality in the Roman Empire, of Galilee in northern Palestine, and Perea east of the Jordan River and Dead Sea, and ruled throughout Jesus of Nazareth's ministry. And if you look here, I'm going to show you this map in a second. Yeah, here it is. So if you look at the map here, this pinkish looking colors, that is the territories under the rule of Herod Antipas, the tetrarch. And you can see up here, there's a guide that tells you it is. And the other tetrarchs or rulers are Archelaus and Philip at the time. Don't ask why there's 3, not 4. But anyway, that's how that works. And you can see where the Sea of Galilee is there. So you can see where is Galilee up here, and then this territory down here. Now, Herod Antipas, also known as Herod the Tetrarch, ruled over Galilee. Hence, his jurisdiction over Jesus as his subject was present in Pilate's eyes when Herod Antipas is present at Jerusalem at the time of the trial of Jesus. So I don't know if you remember, but Pilate says, "Oh, I've heard that Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch, is in town. He's nearby, so he's in Jerusalem. Even though he doesn't rule in Jerusalem, he rules the subjects of Galilee." But Pilate puts 2 and 2 together and says, "Hey, Jesus from Galilee, he's the subject of his. Oh, let me send him to Herod." And he meant Herod Antipas because he's here in town, and get him to make a decision on this. So you'll see there's something important about that. Hand back to Herod in a minute. And so I just want you to know that Jesus was very aware that the same Herod that Pilate returned Jesus to for a verdict Jesus had already been informed in Luke 13 that this Herod intends to kill him. So just want you to know the Herodians felt threatened, even the grandsons, even the sons. This is a son of Herod the Great. They had the same fear as Herod the Great that this Messiah would come and he would usurp their authority. They claimed they were the kings, appointed by Rome, though, that they would be exclusive and they were going to kill anyone who got in the way. And that was Jesus. So let's read Luke 13, verses 31 to 33 in part. I'm going to just set it up because it's a lot of contextual stuff as well. In context, Jesus is preaching impliedly far away from Jerusalem, and instead he's in Galilee where Herod the Tetrarch had authority. Jesus is warned by religious rulers to depart evidently from Galilee, because, quote, Herod, meaning in that context, Antipas, Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great. Herod the Great died, by the way, around 4 AD, so he's long out of the picture. So Herod the Tetrarch has been ruling for quite some time. So they tell Jesus that Herod, wants to kill you. Jesus' response is to say that he, quote, must walk today and tomorrow and the day following. That's a 3 days journey, the time it would take to go from Galilee to Jerusalem, for it cannot be that a prophet perish outside of Jerusalem. So in other words, he knows that his fate is with this man. This man is going to kill him. And so we're never really given a clear indication that Herod Antipas gave that clear instruction to Pilate, but Jesus knew that would be what he would be doing. And I want to show you can imply from something else that Herod the Antipas did give that instruction. So here's some evidence that Jesus was being told, Pilate was being told to kill Jesus. Okay. So listen to this. Initially, Antipas was pleased to see Jesus when he's sent by Pilate during the trial of Jesus, hoping to see him perform a miracle. That's what it says. But when Jesus remained silent in the face of questioning, Antipas mocked him and sent him back to Pilate. Not a very nice thing to do. Luke says that these events improved relations between Pilate and Herod despite their earlier enmity. So whatever happened when Pilate kills Jesus, the relationship between Herod and Pilate are healed, and they become positive when they were negative. So what does that tell you? Herod must have given a private message that, of course, Luke doesn't have personal knowledge about. So, but the actions of Herod and Pilate show that whatever happened between the two of them, the execution of Jesus that followed, the return of Jesus by Herod Antipas to Pilate, was satisfactory. That killing of Jesus was what he wanted. Well, of course it was what he wanted, because that was already in Luke 17 to begin with. So if you read Luke 17, again, with Luke telling you that when Pilate kills Jesus, the relationship between them improved dramatically. So this is another thing where you've got to sometimes mesh things together so you can see the bigger context and the bigger picture. And therefore, clearly, it seems to me, Herod Antipas, again, in Josephus, Solus is a kinsman of Herod Antipas. Okay, and we can show you the same thing in some relevant statement that is in Acts 13:1, but we'll go there later. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so next we'll talk a little bit more about Herod Agrippa the First. Okay, he is a grandson of Herod the Great. Okay, he's also known as Agrippa the First because there's another one called Agrippa the Second. He was a king of Judea. He was a grandson of Herod the Great and the father of Herod Agrippa the Second, the last known king from the Herodian dynasty. He was acquaintance of or friend of Roman emperors and even played crucial roles in eternal Roman politics. So he spent a lot of times in Rome. So when Paul salutes a relative in Rome in his epistle to the Romans in chapter 16, he says, "Greet my kinsman, my relative Herodion," which means little Herod, which means his kinsman, his relative, is a member of the Herodian family. That's Eisenman makes that point that kind of name wouldn't be used by other people. It was exclusive to the Herodian family. So Herodion, little Herod, was clearly a relative of Paul, meaning Paul was a relative of the Herodians. So that fits, again, what we're going to see when Solus in Josephus is said to be a relative of Herod Antipas, the very same person that is involved in the killing of Jesus. Okay. So again, Paul is very clear near the center of the group that want to kill Jesus. They are the Herodians. All right. Now, this Herod Agrippa the First is an uncle to Herod Antipas. So Herod Antipas's father or sister has to be a relative of the father or sister that gave birth to Herod the First. So let me just jump ahead and show you this. So if you look at Antiquities of the Jews and you look at 20.9.4, you'd be looking at this where it says, Costabarus also and Solus did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of the royal family, and so they obtained favor among them because of their kindred to Agrippa. But still they used violence with the people and were ready to plunder those that were weaker within themselves. So Paul had this violent tendency, not just when he persecuted Christians, but well before that. And so this is clearly stating that he was of the royal family, whoever this Solus was. If it is Paul, then it's saying it's Paul was of the royal family, and they obtained favor because of their kindred to Agrippa. So the royal favor meant kindred to King Agrippa in his area of Judea, but also that means Solus was a relative of maybe another Herod ruler, Herod Agrippa, Herod the Tetrarch, or Herod Antipas, which again, when we look, we'll show you later, if you look at Acts 13, verse 1, Paul's a boyhood friend of Manaen and Herod the Tetrarch. And I want to dive in a little deeper on Herod Antipas, because in the second quote from Josephus, it's from the Jewish Wars, or the War of the Jews, that he mentions Solus in league with Antipas. So let's look at it a little closer. This is from Herod Antipas, Wikipedia. Jesus' ministry and trial. Among those baptized by John was Jesus of Nazareth, who began his own ministry in Galilee, causing Antipas, according to Matthew and Mark, to fear that John had been raised from the dead. Luke alone, among the Gospels, states that a group of Pharisees warned Jesus that Antipas was plotting his death, whereupon Jesus denounced the Tetrarch as a fox. So you can see there right below in Luke 13, verse 31, King James, that he's warned, Jesus warned, Herod will kill you. They mean Herod the Tetrarch, Antipas. That's the region he's talking in, as I explained earlier. If you read the whole context, he has a 3 days walk to get to Jerusalem. So he's not in Jerusalem, he's at Galilee. And that's why we can put him 3 days away from Jerusalem. He says a prophet can't die outside of Jerusalem. So he's got 3 days of walking to get there. Anyway, so that's the bottom line about who Antipas is here. And why do I mention it? I'm going to race ahead so you can see something ahead of time. Let's race over here. So not in Antiquities of the Jews, but here in the books of the Jewish War, it's going to say what? Among whom the most eminent were. Now, in these people who are men of power and working with Agrippa, the most eminent were Saul and Antipas. So these were working together, who were of the king's kindred, who were kin to Herod's family, meaning the king Agrippa, who was a nephew of Antipas. So these men, Saul and Antipas, are older men who the younger ruler Agrippa is working with them. Okay, so now let's turn again to the famous quotes about Paul by Robert Eisenman, where he is writing a book called James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesher, 2018 work, 154 pages. Highly recommend everybody gets this. He is going to give you further background for preparation to understand the passages we're looking at in Josephus. So he mentions first that Epiphanius, this is a Christian commentator in the 300s, middle 300s, insists that James the Just wore the mitre of the high priest. So again, in the Habakkuk Pesher, it's written by someone who's obviously the Zadik, the just one. Apparently, very clearly, it's James the Just if you look at our series of episode 17 up to this point. Eisen's mentioning this fact as a precursor to the next fact. So when you put the next fact together, you're going to see there's a violent reaction by somebody who obviously was Paul to harm James the Just prior to his experience on the road to Damascus, as he relates it. So next he says this, and this is in the book James the Just by Professor Eisenman. One should be chary of dismissing vivid details such as these without carefully considering them. For instance, the Clementines are particularly forthcoming in telling us that James broke either one or both of his legs in a riot that erupted on the Temple Mount at the instigation of an enemy, clearly intended to represent Paul. Okay, remember Rufinus goes over and he rewrites the whole work and destroys all the original manuscripts. But he's preserving something of church history. If you knew the keys of how to figure it out, well, whenever Paul appears, it's renamed Simon Magus, and all the scholars concur this is an obvious, transparent change from Paul to Simon Magus, and that's why it gets the label pseudo Clementines, because it's a false version. It's not the true original version, so everybody has to be warned about that initially. But there's truth-telling in there anyway. Rufinus didn't destroy all of it. So when he translated into Latin from Greek or whatever language it was, he destroyed all his manuscripts. We can't 100% be sure, but a high probability is you can read through the lines that it was Paul. But this is why it's important, because what Paul was involved in pre-road to Damascus was creating a riot in this situation, and that's why he was able to run up to the Temple Mount and throw James off the balcony or the pinnacle, if you will. All right, and he says this: a riot that has as its counterpart the notice in the Antiquities of Josephus after the stoning of James about a riot in Jerusalem led by one Solus. Solus. So that's the introduction here. Now we're going to get into Solus in Josephus. The same Solus would also appear to be the intermediary between, quote, the men of power, the high priests, the principal of the Pharisees, all those desirous for peace in the Roman sense of peace, and Agrippa, King Agrippa, we've been talking to you about, whom Josephus also calls Solus' kinsman. Now, I've already given you previews on that, and this is his citation in footnote 11 to these passages in Antiquities 20.9.4 and Ward 2.17.3. And so we're going to take a look at those next. Let me just see if there's anything else I need to tell you about. Okay, we already covered this. Salute my kinsmen, greet them to be the household Narcissus. So we know that from Romans 16:11, Paul has admitted indirectly that he's an Herodian. And I'll show you one more thing, though. This is kind of nails it. In Acts 13:1, if you read this passage and you just fix the which there, it should be Mene and who had been brought up. And then you read this the way it should read. In Greek, there's no punctuation. So you just have to accept that when you want to punctuate something, you have to move words around to where they belong. If they're in a series and you want something to be in a series, you have to put it in that series. You can't ask people to imagine it belongs somewhere else in the sentence. You'll see what I mean in a second. Here's the sentence. Now there were in the church that was in Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So when you read it that way, where there's no punctuation, because Greek has no punctuation, in fact, there's no spaces between words. You have to literally read it out loud. I showed you in the prior episode that this is called continuous speech. And so the only way to interpret it is you have to actually read it out loud and see what the sentence structure is when you play it out in your head. So who Manaen had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. Herod the Tetrarch is Antipas. Antipas is the person who Luke said the religious rulers told Jesus that that you are going to be, he wants to kill you. Herod the Tetrarch wants to kill you is what it means in context. So that person who was raised up with Manaen was also raised up with Saul. That's two people. Manaen had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. See, and that makes sense. He's a relative. So again, when we're going to see these passages I've already shown you quick previews of these passages in Antiquities and in the Jewish Wars. You can see already you have a strong connection now between Paul and Solus of Josephus. So now we can read it with that background. So it took a little while to give you the background, but I hope you realize how important it is to see the bigger picture. All right, so now I'm going to merely read these passages to you, and the real significance of the passage is not what the topic is about. It's about who Solus is and what family he's related to. Anyway, this is a work from 1825, the works of Flavius Josephus, book 20, and I'm searching for 20.9.4, and I found point 4 here. And now I could read you this whole thing, and that's a possibility. But I'm going to try to spare you of that and just read you enough that you need to know. So just imagine there's this thing going on with King Agrippa, something he built in Caesarea Philippi, and he was ordinarily hated by his subjects because he took things away that belonged to them to a foreign city. All right, so King Agrippa, the nephew of King King Antipas. He's a nephew who's not very popular with people. He just doesn't do the right thing. And there's a sedition that rose out between the high priests with regard to one another, for they got together bodies of the boldest sort of the people, and frequently came from reproaches to throwing of stones at each other. But Ananias was too hard for the rest by his riches, which enabled him to gain those who were most ready to receive. So there's some bribery going on by Ananias. So what you see here is the lower order priests are rebelling against the high priest's office, and they want more money. That's basically what it comes down to. And Ananias is using his money to bribe people to over to his side. Okay. Then it says this. Costabarus also and Solus did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of the royal family, meaning of the Herod King Agrippa, who, again, he's the nephew of King Antipas, or aka Herod the Tetrarch. And so they obtained favor among them because of their kindred to Agrippa. So Solus and Costabarus were both kindred to Agrippa, Herod Agrippa, who was the nephew to Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch. But still they used violence with people. So this Solus and Costabarus used violence with the people. And remember what we read you from the Clementines, there was violence involved there against James by Solus or by Paul. And were ready to plunder those that were weaker than themselves. And from that, it principally came to pass that our city was greatly disordered and that all the things grew worse and worse among us. And that's it for this passage. Now I'm going to show you the War of the Jews. Okay, so now we've reached our final slide. This is from the Books of the Jewish War. You'll see where I got it from, wikisource.org, Wiki, the War of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 17. And this is subpart 4, as it's cited here, 217.3. I think that's a typo. He should have said 4, at least in the numbering at this website I found. And so here you'll see. I'm going to read the whole paragraph here because it's not that long. And as they said these things, they produced those priests that were skillful in the customs of their country, who made the report that all their forefathers had received the sacrifices from foreign nations. I'm going to stop there. So this is about, should you receive foreigners bringing sacrifices? But still not one of the innovators would hearken to what was said. Nay, those that ministered about the temple would not attend their divine service, but were preparing matters for beginning the war. Okay, so there's people who said, no, we should not receive sacrifices from pagans at the temple. So the men of power, perceiving that sedition was too hard for them to subdue, and that the danger which would arise from the Romans would come upon them first of all, endeavored to save themselves and sent ambassadors, some to Florus, the chief of which was Simon the son of Ananias, and others to Agrippa. That's king. Remember, he's the nephew of Antipas, Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas is of the same generation as Solus, as we saw in the prior one, among whom the most eminent were Saul and Antipas and Costabarus, who were of the king's kindred. King is whom? In this picture, Agrippa is acting as the king. These are outliers, meaning Antipas is in a separate province that he's ruling. Saul is connected to Antipas because I showed you he was a boyhood friend of Herod the Tetrarch. Again, if this is Paul. And Costabarus, who were the king's kindred, meaning members of the family of Herod Agrippa, which means they're the Herod of Herod. They're also the family of Herod Antipas. And they desired of them both that they would come with an army to the city and cut off the seditious before it should be too hard to be subdued. So this group of people are getting together to cut off the seditious people who don't want to accept foreign sacrifices. Now, that tells you before Saul, if this is the same person, Paul, that means he's already against obeying God's law before he has this experience allegedly on the road to Damascus. So he's already trying to say, hey, you've got to accept these sacrifices, pagan sacrifices at our temple. Now, this terrible message was good news to Florus, and because his design was to have a war kindled, he gave the ambassadors no answer at all. But Agrippa was equally solicitous for those that were revolting, and for those against whom the war was to be made, and was desirous to preserve the Jews for the Romans, and the temple and the metropolis for the Jews. He was also sensible that it was not for his own advantage that the disturbances should proceed. So this is a very more strategic Agrippa than Herod Antipas. So this nephew of Herod Antipas is a little bit more tactical. So he sent 3,000 horsemen to the assistance of the people of Orontis, and Batanea, and Trachonitis, and these under Darius, the master of his horse, and Philip, the son of Jachimus, the general of his army. So I'm not going to give more context because I'm not trying to explain what happened in these events. Just you can see that this now makes it very clear that Saul and Antipas were kindred King Agrippa. So now you have 100% confirmation of what you're seeing in Acts 13, verse 1. Menahem was a childhood friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul makes perfect sense. They're relatives. Why is Paul in 16:13 of Romans saluting Herodion, meaning little Herod, meaning he's his, and he calls him a kindred. He's his relative because he's part of the Herodian family, and was engaged in this kind of activity long before he became a road to Damascus type Christian. So he was already fighting against the strict Jewish views. You can't have foreign sacrifices at the temple. These foreigners were not God-fearers. These were people who wanted to sacrifice to their gods at the Temple of Jerusalem. And Saul and Antipas and Agrippa all want that their gods to be observed at the Temple of Jerusalem, and the priests there won't have it. And so you can see Paul's already on the side of what? Law negation, getting rid of the law, accommodating everybody. Don't offend anyone. They want to sacrifice at our Temple of Jerusalem. Go ahead. That means that's why he has to endorse later as a quote Christian that you can eat meat sacrificed to idols in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, because it means, well, the temple, by the way, is still up at that time. So he would have said, hey, why, if you can eat meat sacrificed to idols, since an idol is nothing, why not just let him in and sacrifice? Because it doesn't mean anything. It has no significance to Yahweh. Let them sacrifice on Yahweh's altar their own sacrifices to Jupiter, to whatever, Mars, whatever it is, King Saul Invictus, whoever it was. He was already an accommodator before he became what I call a road to Damascus Christian. Okay, everybody. I hope that helps you. Ciao. Goodbye. Ciao.